So, in the 7th generation of consoles, Microsoft successfully implemented all the accumulated experience in the Xbox 360, while Nintendo amazed the market with their innovative Wii. But what about Sony? After the unfathomable success of the PS2, it seemed that even having such formidable competitors would not prevent the third PlayStation from crashing the market once again. Many of us remember the PS3, but although this console can hardly be called a failure, it didn't nearly reach the success of its predecessors. Today, we'll be talking about what went wrong for Sony. If you remember, I started the video about PlayStation 2 by saying that the development started with some sort of a creative impasse, when the devs simply didn't know how to develop their new product. It seems like Sony hasn't really learned much since then. Now, of course, who am I to call out the industry's titan for its incompetence? But the very first presentation of the future console at E3 2005 turned out to be a 2-hour ramble about how greatly performative the new console will be. 2 HDMI ports, 3 Ethernet ports, awesome trailers for Killzone, F1 and MotorStorm. If they didn't turn out to be obvious pre-rendered fakes, everything would have been great. There were no actual demos of any games, as well as the console's prototype, so the PS3 didn't come out until 2006. Here, they showed actual gameplay of several games, which, expectedly, was much more humble than last year's commercials and the PlayStation itself. The price was also announced, $600 for the full version and $500 for the stripped down version that had a smaller hard drive, no HDMI, card reader or Wi-Fi. So here's the question, why on earth would anyone splash out for it when there's already the tested Xbox 360 that costs only $300? The price could be justified by the console's hardware, but it had a certain nuance. The PS3 indeed came out quite powerful, no point denying that. For a while, there was a rumor that a scientist from Massachusetts used PS3 cluster systems to assemble a supercomputer for the research and simulation of black holes. The paradox is that usual computers of the same computing power would have costed a fortune in comparison with such method. And apparently, the third PlayStation was made exactly for scientists, because all the developers were wailing about the overly complicated architecture of the console. They just couldn't make use of all the immense power that was teased in presentations, which led to the PS3 ports often getting downgraded graphics and frame rate. The famous Gabe Newell, in one of his interviews, advised Sony to scrap everything and start from scratch. That's how bad it was. In addition, the first version of the console would constantly overheat and break down. How could they not? So the company had to spend a good amount of time simply finishing and polishing their brainchild. This even affected the gamepad, which had a shtick of determining its position in space, but at first was lacking the familiar vibration function due to patent disputes. Well, at least it wasn't the bent variant, concepts of which got leaked sometime prior. I mean, you can't even throw this thing into the wall, it would fly right back. The PS3 also stood out for its psychedelic commercials, inherited from its predecessors. For example, how about that one commercial that shows a baby doll sitting in an empty room in front of the console? When the doll starts crying and the console starts floating, you can't help but wonder if David Lynch was at it again. But I've got too much focus on Sony's mistakes. After all, they had to be proud of as well. For example, the PlayStation 3 was in demand as a cheap, affordable, quality Blu-ray player. I remember that a lot of people were interested in the console not only for its main purpose, but also for the ability to watch high-res movies. The games were also good, especially when Sony had polished the console and the developers had learned how to handle it.
Jimmy, just stay back! Jimmy, I am warning you! Go!
Take The Last of Us, for example, which came out at the sunset of the support for the third PlayStation. I'm sure everyone has at least heard about it, especially considering the notorious sequel, but just in case, let me remind you of the synopsis. In this third-person action-adventure, we play as a smuggler named Joel, living or rather surviving in a post-apocalyptic America. Most of humanity went extinct due to an infestation of a dangerous fungus. All coincidences with real events are coincidental. The story then develops like a great Hollywood action movie with drama and plot twists. and I highly recommend familiarizing yourself with it by at least watching a video, or better yet, playing the game yourself. The in-game world, both story-wise and gameplay-wise, feels alive and realistic. Take, for example, the local stealth. The sections where you have to sneak past unnoticed are quite intense, and it is perfectly justified by the events and the setting. Graphics-wise, the game was also great, squeezing that initially promised potential from the console.
You see this? Shh, don't scare it.
I won't.
What are you doing?
It's alright. Come here.
Speaking of the PS3, it should be said that not every great title was released at the end of the console's lifecycle. Naughty Dog, who made The Last of Us, released the Uncharted series before. It was a no less great adventure action about treasure hunting, locations exploring, and acrobatics on rocks, lianas, and other natural objects. I got acquainted with Uncharted much later than I should have, when Tomb Raider had already been rebooted for the second time, and my first impressions of the gameplay were like, now these are the adventures of Lara Croft that we lost. By the way, the game's protagonist named Nathan Drake seemed even more interesting, because he was much more agile, easier to control, and would constantly give comments and jokes about what's going on.
Well, if it isn't the beautiful and talented Elena Fisher.
Flattery will get you screen time.
Yeah, I'm more of a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. Victor Sullivan.
For Christ's sakes.
As for the adventures themselves, again, I can say that in the first part, Nathan is searching for El Dorado, in the second one he follows in the footsteps of Marco Polo, and in the third game he explores the mysteries of his ancestor Francis Drake. But it's better to immerse in the story yourself. After all, Naughty Dog has some weak sides, but storytelling certainly isn't one of them. Another example of an even more thrilling story was Heavy Rain. It's a detective story about finding a serial killer who leaves origami at the crime scenes. The premise of the game is obscenely simple. There's a certain action on the screen, like one long cutscene, and occasionally buttons for contextual actions pop up, resembling QuickTime events. But as in real life, a failed action does not result in a game over. Instead, the story continues, suggesting, as in Morrowind, that you persist in the doomed world you have created. Thanks to this, Heavy Rain can rightfully be called an interactive movie. At the same time, the actions required from the player did not feel like a random set of buttons shoved into a cutscene. Everything was always coherent and tied to what was happening at the moment, so you simply couldn't get enough of it. The immersion was heavily complemented by the PS Move controller, which was added just a week after the game's release. Speaking of the controller, it was the obvious response to Nintendo's Wiimote with roughly the same functionality. It too was tracking movements, allowing you to aim and wave your hands to perform virtual actions. The main difference between them I would call rather subjective. The movement tracking seemed to be a bit more precise, the shape was a bit more convenient than that of a rectangular Wiimote, and PS Move also had a funny glowing ball that helped the console to track the position of the controller in space. No, really, I could spend quite some time watching that thing glowing. In some games, you also had to wield the DualShock to move the character, but this problem was solved by Nintendo's nunchuck, by PlayStation's navigation controller. Move supported a whole bunch of games, among which you could find trivial sports simulators and shooting galleries, as well as major titles. For example, I personally found Resident Evil 5 not that interesting, but playing it with motion control was actually quite fun. But back to Heavy Rain. This feature intensified the immersion effect because now you had not only to respond to the hints on screen, but to actually move. Such a seemingly insignificant detail made the already fascinating narrative even more exciting. A different kind of atmosphere was in Siren Blood Curse, a rethinking of the famous Forbidden Siren with an addition of the mechanics from its sequel and new ideas. At first glance, it was a classic horror about a group of journalists who went to a Japanese village and found a group of very interesting young people who spent their free time sacrificing others. There was also a number of questionable decisions, such as somewhat lacerated storytelling through episode and jumps from one character to another, combat system that made fighting monsters a lot easier, tons of hints, and much more. But most importantly, the game was actually damn scary, what made it quite addictive. There was some magic in the masterfully made darkness, the character animations, the soundtrack, and even the episodic storytelling eventually turned out to be a creepy and well-crafted investigation. For the closest thing to this horror game is Silent Hill. When you play the game, follow the events, and after a couple of hours, you just can't escape the rushing atmosphere of a Japanese horror. Speaking of titles with a deep plot, it's illegal not to mention Metal Gear Solid. Unlike other major installments of the series, Part 4 never made it beyond the PS3, which is a damn shame really, because it is actually an awesome game. That tactical spy action, which MGS has always been, reached its climax by moving directly to the battlefield. And that's not just the setting description. During the development process, the game's slogan was "No place to hide." According to the story, the world is torn by war, which is why Solid Snake has to take cover not in the cramped spaces and not even in the woods, but right in the middle of the battlefield. To this end, of course, the variety of gadgets was expanded once again. For example, the new suit allowed you to mimic the texture of the surface the character was pressed against, which oftentimes allowed you to hide in plain sight. The story also reached its climax. Over the many years the series has been around, there were multiple storylines, and almost all of them have come to a logical end here. Even the look of the aged Snake himself hinted the conclusion of the series. All in all, this is definitely a game worth buying the third PlayStation even today.
On the little big planet, you're a little sack person. This one is you? Oh, bless. You're quite a cute one.
But enough about serious titles for grown-ups. For example, back in the day, a game called Little Big Planet was no less anticipated than MGS4. It was a puzzle platformer about small rag people named Sackboy, or Sackgirl if you prefer female characters. The gameplay brought back the warm memories of 8-bit two-dimensional adventures, and the atmosphere was much more cute. Everything in the game is made of cardboard, rocks, ropes, and various improvised materials in general, with their relatively realistic physics. In addition to the feeling of handcrafted locations, it also allowed you to interact with almost every piece of environment. For example, if there was a pile of rubble ahead, you could declutter it, and then use stuff from the pile to climb higher or activate the scales. All of that sounds cool, but the best thing they did in Little Big Planet was the level creator. Here's where your imagination could run wild, which is why some creative player used it to recreate Mirror's Edge, Jurassic Park, and even a working calculator. It's even a little strange that it wasn't a Nintendo game. An equally unique game was Gran Turismo 5, just a trivial racing simulator it would seem, but with this game I don't even know where to begin. For starters, let's take the remarkable 5-minute intro, which shows us the world of professional racing from the factory where the car parts are made all the way to the racing track. You might think, who in their right mind would take so much time before letting the player into the game? But in this case, it felt like an appropriate opening for a massive project. Now, some fast facts. The game has more than 1,000 cars, although 800 of them came from the previous part, but still, insanely realistic physics with damage models and a whole mountain of various models. You could start with quick races or the career mode, then an hour later find yourself making beautiful pictures of cars from replays, and 2 hours later disappear into the B-Spec mode where you take the role of the director of a racing team. Yes, here you could not only drive yourself, but also manage a team of virtual racers, analyzing their behavior and influencing it with various recommendations. Gran Turismo 5 is truly a colossal title. And since we're talking about unique titles, how can we possibly not say anything about Journey? Technically, it's another movie game like Heavy Rain, but of an entirely different kind. Instead of the usual cutscenes or even gameplay that would introduce us to the characters, here, the player can find a very meditative journey, just as the title says. Essentially, all you have to do is to walk through a desert. But each player will take something different from the experience. Maybe Journey will inspire you to move forward until you reach your goal, or make you think about the cyclical nature of everything around you. Even if all you get out of it is an hour and a half of admiring the scenery, I would still recommend spending them and undertaking this journey for yourself. As usual, a great chunk of the console's hits consisted of all kinds of shooters. Here we can say a couple of words about Renaissance: Fall of Man, a first-person shooter about an alternative history of the 20th century. In a nutshell, the 1917 revolution in Russia was crushed, so the Soviet Union never happened and the country closed its borders. Then falls the Tunguska meteorite, which begins to affect the climate and nature around it. But there's no information about the event until hordes of evil mutants start dispersing from within the country, whom players have to fight all the way on the British Isles. And you said that all aliens and monsters happen to appear in New York? The most memorable feature was the game's weapons. Contrary to the standard bundle of pistols, rifle, shotgun, players were given extremely creative guns that greatly enhanced the tactical options, and they actually came in handy in the fight against smart and cunning opponents, whose design, by the way, also pleased with its diversity. And perhaps that's the strongest side of Resistance, is that it was a shit ton of fun gameplay wise. Of course, such a project was bound to have sequels, and if the second part came out just good, the third part managed to develop the advantages of the original and became a great action game that made a lot of noise in its time.
We were fighting for our very existence. But if there are those who would deny us peace...
Killzone 2, on the other hand, wasn't about unusual gameplay, but the beauty of its execution. It was another first-person shooter with the gentleman's feature kit of its time. Vehicles, shelters, interface without a health bar, everything is right on trend. The story also didn't stand out for any unusual details. A dystopian future where humanity is exploring space and naturally encounters a hostile alien race. In the first part, we repelled the attack, which is why now we are the ones acting on the offensive. Thanks to this, players were introduced to the planet Helgen, and I've gotta say that its landscapes were actually impressive. Of course, I'm not talking about the aesthetics of garbage piles and radioactive terrain, although there was something in it as well, but about the lighting, details, and special effects. Perhaps the only game able to compete with Killzone 2 in terms of graphics was Metal Gear Solid 4. Another thing worth mentioning is physics that allowed enemies to perform impressive somersaults even in death. And all this didn't lag or stutter even in the most intense scenes. Makes you remember all these stories about the power of PS3.
What are you doing? Dave is not coming. Ah, ignore him. Come on, we gotta get this thing ready before we dock. Let's go.
Speaking of hardware-intensive games, how can we leave aside the legendary GTA 4? The fourth part got completely overshadowed by the fifth part and San Andreas, which is actually an awful injustice. The game's protagonist, with the characteristic Serbian name Niko Bellic, used to be a criminal element, like the franchise's other protagonists, but unlike his predecessors, he moved to Liberty City in search of the American dream. He was invited there by his cousin Roman, the man, the myth, the bowling enthusiasts.
Nico, it's Roman.
No.
Let's go.
Gameplay-wise, GTA 4 could be described as same stuff, but better. More car driving, shooting, and completing missions, but with a whole bunch of innovations, from the ability to choose a mission to an online mode, all with a great emphasis on realism. Perhaps the fourth part was missing that good old farce and madness, but other than that, it's undoubtedly a worthy successor in the series. I would like to end today's video with Infamous, an action game that became a great superhero simulator. Here we play as Cole McGrath, who was caught at ground zero of a massive explosion that granted him the ability of electrokinesis. Unlike licensed superhero games of the time, which tried to stretch the character's abilities to the game situations, here, various supernatural skills served both movement and combat systems. This allowed the player to shoot lightning, fly, glide on wires, use energy in melee combat, and all of that was extremely convenient to perform. As for the weak sides, I personally would mention the story, which wasn't bad, but can hardly be called outstanding as well, and the karma system, which can be described as a good guy should spare the defeated while the bad one will finish him, and it didn't even affect the playthrough that much. However, all of this was overshadowed by the extremely fun gameplay, which stood out for its combat. The set of abilities and the convenience of controls allowed for constant experimentation and change of playstyle, keeping you engaged until the end credits. So what I'm saying is, despite the fact that Sony screwed up absolutely everything, the PS3 is remembered for its great titles, especially exclusives. Of course, the console didn't exactly blow up the market as its predecessors did, but it certainly wasn't a failure either. Moreover, the mistakes allowed the company to learn how to interact with the audience and work with the next gen, which can be seen in the success of the PS4, which is still relevant for a number of reasons. As for the third PlayStation, all that's left is to invite you to the comments to share your memories about the console. As always, please leave a like, a subscribe for more content. By now, we've touched base on every gaming console from 8-bit ones to the platforms of today, and even said a couple of words about PCs. But our gaming experience is certainly much larger than that. There are still many more interesting topics to cover, I's to dot and T's to cross, so remember to tune in next time.